My father slid the wine glass across the table, his voice like stone. "Stop acting so important. You are just an obstacle." My mother added, her smile like a blade. "That's right. A pale shadow next to your brother." They saw a problem, and this wine was their solution. But they forgot that even shadows can learn to kill. My name is Major Catherine Elfrida Ashford. I am 33 years old. The air in our McLean, Virginia estate was always the same, thick with the cloying scent of money and unspoken resentments. It was an atmosphere I had learned to navigate with the same precision I applied to a battlefield. Tonight, the grand dining room was a tableau of Washington, D.C. power, a carefully curated collection of political and military elite, all orbiting my father, the retired four-star General Alastair Ashford. He sat at the head of the table, a marble statue of a man, his presence casting a long cold shadow over everything. I was a decorated officer from the Pentagon, a West Point graduate, his daughter, yet his eyes slid past me as if I were part of the decor. My mother, Serafina, was the master of this theater. She moved through the room with a practiced grace, her smile a perfectly calibrated weapon. "Catherine just received another commendation," she announced to a visiting senator, her voice dripping with a hollow pride. "We're so terribly proud." The words were correct, but they were empty calories, devoid of any real nourishment. In the next breath, her attention shifted entirely to my younger brother, Lieutenant Tristan Ashford. "I just don't understand why his commanding officer doesn't see his potential," she fretted, her brow furrowed with an exaggerated concern that was reserved only for him. "Tristan is a natural leader." I watched Tristan soak it in, his posture puffing up with unearned confidence. He was the designated heir to the Ashford legacy, the golden boy whose failures were always someone else's fault. Later, as the main course was cleared, my mother turned to me, her expression a mask of sweet concern. "You're so sharp, dear," she said, the word landing like an insult. "Men don't like women who are too sharp." From the head of the table, the statue finally spoke. My father didn't look at me, but at the crystal glass in his hand. "A legacy needs softness," he rumbled, his voice low and final. "Not a blade." A blade. That's what I was to him. Not a daughter, but a tool, and the wrong one at that. The words were an invisible cut, a clean, precise strike meant to sever me from the family name. It was a familiar wound, one I had learned to ignore. But then came something new. Serafina rose, her movements fluid, as she retrieved a bottle of deep ruby red wine from the sideboard. A Bordeaux, a Chateau Margaux, to be precise. A bottle worth more than a month of my major's salary, a symbol of the rarefied world they inhabited. She poured a single glass, her smile never faltering, and brought it to me. "Drink, my love," she murmured, her voice a silken caress, "to the future of our family." I took the glass. My training, the years of discipline at the point, had honed my senses to a razor's edge. The moment the wine touched my lips, my internal alarms screamed. It was wrong. Beneath the rich notes of dark fruit and oak, there was something else, a faint, acrid undertone, metallic. A searing heat began to spread from my tongue down my throat, a chemical burn that had no place in a vintage Bordeaux. My eyes shot up, scanning the faces around me. My mother smiling her perfect smile. My brother looking bored. My father impassive, his gaze fixed on some distant point. They were all calm, horrifyingly, unnaturally calm. And in that frozen moment, I understood. This wasn't a celebration, it was an execution, a meticulously staged elegantly presented execution. The shock was a physical blow, a primal terror that ripped through years of disciplined composure. The people who were supposed to be my ultimate sanctuary were my assassins. The world began to blur at the edges, the poison working with brutal efficiency. The polished silverware, the glittering chandelier, the faces of the guests, it all swam in a sickening vortex. As my strength failed, as my body slumped in the chair, I heard their voices, distant and cold, like a transmission from another world. Seraphina's voice, stripped of all its warmth. Everything has been arranged. The $33 million trust will be transferred to Tristan to handle the problem in Belgium. Then my father's, devoid of any emotion, the voice of a general assessing a tactical situation. She was always a difficult variable, a necessary adjustment to protect the formation. Variable, adjustment, formation. The words hammered into my fading consciousness. They had stripped me of my humanity, reduced me to a logistical problem. I wasn't their daughter. I was an obstacle, a loose end to be tied up. My hand spasmed, knocking the heavy crystal glass. It tipped, spilling the dark red wine across the pristine white tablecloth. The stain spread, a splash of blood on a perfect, lying canvas. Then there was only darkness. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a hostile invasion. It started with the cold, a damp chill seeping through my clothes from the stone floor beneath me. Then came the smell, a thick, cloying mixture of damp earth, soured wine, and decay. My head throbbed with a brutal, percussive rhythm, a blacksmith's hammer against an anvil. My body felt heavy, disconnected, a vessel drained of all strength. They had stripped me of everything, my jacket, my phone, my dignity, and left me here to die. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. They believed I would simply fade away. A quiet and convenient resolution to their problems. They had forgotten where they sent me. They had forgotten the lessons West Point drills into you until they are part of your DNA. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford. Emotion is a weight you cannot carry. So I didn't panic. My training took over, a calm, cold current in the chaos of my physical misery. I began a situational assessment, my mind a checklist in the dark. No obvious exits, no weapons, no comms. I was an officer, compromised and trapped deep behind enemy lines. The horrifying irony was that the enemy line was my own family's wine cellar. In the suffocating darkness, the ghosts of my past, memories I had suppressed with military discipline for years, began to stir. They rose not as hazy recollections, but as sharp, vivid intelligence files, a map of betrayals that led directly to this cold stone floor. I was 14. I had spent a month developing a wargaming strategy for a class project, a complex simulation of a conflict in the South China Sea. My father, General Ashford, had glanced at it, dismissed it with a grunt, and then 2 weeks later, I heard my exact words, my exact strategy, coming from his mouth during a television interview on CNN. When I tried to protest, he had looked at me with cold amusement. Don't be naive, Catherine. Ideas are for the command, not for the cadets. My work, my mind, had been his for the taking. I was 30. I discovered my brother Tristan had copied nearly 40 pages of my postgraduate thesis for a paper he was submitting at the War College. When I confronted him, my mother had stepped between us, her face a mask of disappointment, directed at me. "Your selfishness is truly astounding, Catherine," she'd said, her voice low and venomous. "You would tear your brother down for a few words on a page? He is under so much pressure." But the most damning file, The one that truly defined my role in the Ashford Formation opened when I was 16. I had won the National Youth Science Competition, a $5,000 prize for a robotics project I had built from scratch. It was the first time I had ever felt a sense of accomplishment that was purely my own. The check felt heavy in my hand, a tangible symbol of my own worth. That evening, my parents sat me down in my father's study. There was no celebration. Tristan, then 19, had been in a drunk driving accident. He had wrapped his new convertible around an oak tree. No one was seriously hurt, but the legal trouble was significant. My father explained the situation with chilling clarity. A DUI charge would be a permanent stain on the record of the future Ashford patriarch. We need $5,000 to retain the best lawyer in Virginia, my mother said, her hand on my arm. Someone who can make this all go away quietly. I stared at the check on the table between us. My check. It's your responsibility, Catherine, my father said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Your brother is the future of this family. You're strong. You can handle it. I wasn't the strong child. I was the family's beast of burden, the one who could be relied upon to carry the weight, to sacrifice her triumphs to cover their failures. I signed the check over. They called it a sacrifice for the family's honor. It wasn't. It was the purchase of my brother's clean slate, with the currency of my soul. Each memory was a fresh cut, laying bare the systematic nature of their cruelty. I was a resource to be exploited, a pillar to be leaned on until it snapped. And now that I was a difficult variable, I was to be discarded. My fingers, numb with cold, scraped against the stone as I crawled, searching for anything. A loose brick, a splinter of wood, a weakness, and then my hand closed around something small, cold, and metal. It was heavy, circular, with a raised, intricate design. I didn't need to see it. I knew its weight, its texture by heart. It was my father's old unit challenge coin, the one he had ceremoniously given me on my graduation day from the point. They must have dropped it when they dragged me down here, a piece of pocket litter they had overlooked. A small mistake, a fatal one. To them, it was just a trinket, a piece of brass. To me, it was a testament, a reminder of the honor, the duty, the person I had forged myself into, not because of them, but in spite of them. They had systematically stripped me of everything that mattered. Have you ever felt that? That slow, deliberate erasure by the people who were supposed to build you up? I closed my fist around the coin, the sharp edges digging into my palm. The metal felt like a magnet, drawing all my pain, my humiliation, my years of silent rage into one single concentrated point of energy. A cold fire ignited in my chest, burning away the last vestiges of fear and replacing it with something pure and unyielding. Steel. They thought they were burying a daughter. They had just awakened a soldier. The steel in my hand became the steel in my spine. Escape wasn't a hope, it was a mission objective. My body, though battered and weak from the poison, still housed the mind of an analyst. I began a systematic search of my prison, my hands mapping the damp stone walls in the pitch black. My fingers, raw and scraped, finally found it. A weakness. An old ventilation shaft covered by a rusted metal grate. It was small, but so was I. The challenge coin, once a symbol of my father's hollow praise, now became my primary tool. I used its milled edge as a makeshift screwdriver, wedging it into the heads of the rusted screws. The work was agonizingly slow, a painful testament to patience. Each quarter turn of a screw was a silent vow. One turn for the stolen strategy. One for the stolen prize money, one for the years of being their shield, one for the poison in my veins. Hours later, the grate came loose. I squeezed through the opening, my muscles screaming in protest, and emerged into the cool, damp Virginia night. Filthy, bruised, and wearing only the clothes I had been poisoned in, I slipped into the shadows of the manicured estate. I was no longer Major Elfrida of the Pentagon. I was a ghost, a nameless fugitive with nothing but a coin in my pocket and a fire in my gut. I walked for miles along the dark, empty country roads, every rustle of leaves, every distant headlight, a potential threat. I had no money, no allies, no one to trust. I made it to Baltimore by dawn, a city of brick and grime that felt a world away from the sterile perfection of McLean. The first order of business was survival. In a dingy pawnshop that smelled of dust and desperation, I sold the one valuable thing they had missed, my West Point graduation watch. The man behind the grimy glass counter gave me $150 for a timepiece worth thousands. He didn't see the engraved motto, duty, honor, country. He just saw a desperate woman. I took the cash without a word. It was the price of my anonymity. With the money, I bought a change of clothes from a thrift store and checked into a cheap, hourly rate motel on the outskirts of the city. The room was a small, foul-smelling box with a stained carpet and a bed that sagged in the middle. It was a haven. That evening, I sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, eating cold Campbell's chicken noodle soup straight from the can. The tinny, metallic taste was a grim echo of the poison, but it was sustenance. The room's small television was flickering in the corner, and as I ate, a local news channel into a live feed from a charity gala in Washington, D.C. And there she was, my mother, Seraphina Ashford, draped in a glittering designer gown, her face a portrait of compassion as she stood at a podium. "It is our duty," she said, her voice resonating with practiced sincerity, "to uphold the values of family, of community, of empathy for those less fortunate." A wave of pure, hot rage washed over me, more potent than any poison. The hypocrisy was a physical thing, so vile it made me want to retch. She was speaking of empathy while her own daughter, whom she had tried to murder, was hiding in a roach-infested motel, eating cold soup. They were living on my disappearance. They were celebrating on my grave. This injustice was another kind of toxin, but this one didn't weaken me. It fed the fire. To keep my mind from spiraling, to impose order on the chaos, I spent the next day at the Baltimore Public Library. The quiet, the smell of old paper and knowledge was a balm. I lost myself in the stacks, pulling books at random, needing to focus on anything other than my own reality. It was in a worn, forgotten anthology of American speeches that I found him, Theodore Roosevelt. I found the words that would become my new creed. My eyes scanned the page, and the world fell away. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. A jolt, like an electric current, shot through me. The words weren't just ink on a page, they were a mirror. My family, with their judgments and their cold calculations. They were the critics. They stood on the sidelines, pristine and safe, and pointed out my flaws. But I was the one in the arena. Right now my face was marred by the dust of my escape and the figurative blood of their betrayal. I was the one striving, the one fighting for my very existence. I realized they had made a fundamental miscalculation. They thought that by taking everything from me, my career, my money, my life, they would leave me with nothing. But they had left me with the one thing a soldier needs to win, a clear objective. This was not the end. This was the battle of my life. And I had just found my field manual. The words of Theodore Roosevelt echoed in my mind, a call to arms that silenced the whispers of despair. I was in the arena, but no soldier, no matter how well trained, fights a war alone. It was time to make the most desperate and high-stakes gamble of my life. With the last of my cash from the pawned watch, I bought a burner phone from a grimy corner store in Baltimore. The cheap, lightweight plastic felt alien in my hand, a stark contrast to the dense, encrypted devices I was used to. This was the tool of a fugitive, not an officer. For a long moment, I just stared at it, the fear a cold knot in my stomach. My father's influence was a web with strands reaching into every corner of Washington's power structure. How many people owed him favors? How many were loyal to the legend of General Ashford over the truth of an unknown major? The thought that Colonel Thorne could be one of them was a paralyzing terror. My fingers, trembling slightly, keyed in a number I hadn't called in years, but knew by heart. My thumb hovered over the send button. This was it, a leap of faith into a black abyss. I couldn't risk a voice call, not yet. Instead, I typed a 2-word text, a coded phrase we had established during a particularly brutal winter in the mountains of Afghanistan. A phrase that meant one of our own was compromised, surrounded, and in mortal danger. Fortress compromised. I hit send. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing down on the thin air of the motel room. Each second stretched into an eternity. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, my own heart a frantic drumbeat of hope and terror. My mind raced, playing out every negative outcome. He would ignore it, dismissing it as a prank. He would report it up the chain of command, flagging me as unstable. He would call back, his voice cold with disappointment, bought and paid for by my father's legacy. Then the phone vibrated, a sudden, sharp buzz on the worn-out bedspread that made me flinch. A call from his number. I took a shaky breath, my training battling my fear, and answered. His voice was exactly as I remembered it. A low, calm baritone, a steady anchor in any storm. There was no surprise, no disbelief, no hesitation, just the unwavering professional voice of my former commander, Colonel Xavier X. Thorne. "Report your situation, Major." The sheer normalcy of it, the immediate acceptance of the premise, was a lifeline thrown into my churning sea of panic. I gave my report the way I was trained to, my voice clipped and precise, stripping the horror of its emotion and presenting only the unvarnished facts. "Assassination attempt, Colonel. The enemy is domestic. The enemy is my family." I detailed the poison, the motive of the $33 million trust fund, the chilling conversation I had overheard as I lost consciousness. Thorne listened. His silence wasn't the cold, dismissive silence of my father, which always felt like a judgment. This was the focused, analytical silence of a commander processing critical intelligence, giving my words the weight and seriousness they deserved. When I finished, my throat raw, he didn't question my sanity or my story. He simply breathed a heavy, weary sigh into the phone. "It doesn't surprise me, Catherine," he said, his voice laced with a grim certainty. "I saw a glimpse of it once. We were in a staff meeting, and a sharp young lieutenant, a good kid, just out of ROTC, had the guts to question one of Tristan's half-baked tactical plans. Your father didn't just disagree, he publicly dismantled the boy piece by piece, humiliated him in front of 20 officers. The kid's career never recovered. Your father protects Tristan at all costs. He paused, and his next words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I always knew there was something wrong with them, Catherine. The way your father looked at you, it was as if your success, everything you earned, was a personal insult to him. That was it. That was the sentence that shattered the final wall of my composure. All my life, I had felt it, that cold resentment behind his eyes every time I achieved something he thought should have been Tristan's. I had convinced myself I was imagining it, that I was the ungrateful, paranoid daughter. But to hear it validated, to have my deepest, most painful truth acknowledged by a man I respected more than any other, it was more precious than any medal, more affirming than any commendation. For the first time in my 33 years, I felt truly seen. "Activate Sanctuary Protocol," Thorn commanded, his voice shifting back into crisp operational mode. "It's still in place. Go dark. Stay put. I'll coordinate from here." The efficiency was comforting, the orders a familiar language in a world that had become terrifyingly alien. But it was his next words that changed everything. 4 simple words that carried the weight of a battalion. "You are not alone, Catherine." The dam broke, the tears I had suppressed in the wine cellar, the tears I had choked back in that filthy motel room. They finally came. They streamed down my face in hot, silent tracks. These weren't the tears of a victim. They weren't tears of weakness or despair. They were tears of profound, soul-shaking relief. The crushing weight of solitude, the terror of fighting this war by myself, was lifted from my shoulders. The battle was no longer mine alone. I had a family again. Not one forged by the accident of birth and curdled by lies, but one forged on the battlefield, built on a foundation of honor, loyalty, and unwavering respect. My war had just begun, but now, for the first time, I had an army at my back. The Sanctuary Protocol was ruthlessly efficient. Within hours of my call to Colonel Thorn, I was moved from the grime of Baltimore to a sterile, anonymous safe house, nestled in the rolling green hills of rural Maryland. It was a modern, unremarkable structure on a quiet country road, surrounded by acres of dense woods. For the first time in days, I could breathe without the constant, gnawing fear of discovery. The quiet here was absolute, a thick blanket of silence that was a stark contrast to the chaos raging within me. But the peace was a fragile, thin illusion, and it was shattered by a single encrypted call. "They're not just trying to kill you, Catherine." Thorn's voice was grim, stripped of the warmth from our previous conversation. It was the voice of a commander delivering bad news from the front. "They're trying to erase you, to wipe you off the board completely." He explained, his words precise and brutal. Someone with high-level clearance at the Department of Defense, undoubtedly at my father's behest, had accessed my official service record. The file that had once been a testament to a decade of my life. Every promotion, every deployment, every commendation had been corrupted. The official record now stated that on the night of the dinner party, Major Catherine Elfrida had suffered a severe nervous breakdown, abandoned her post, and gone AWOL. They were building a narrative, a neat, tragic, and utterly false story of a promising officer who couldn't handle the pressure and simply disappeared, likely dead by her own hand in some forgotten place. The news hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind from my lungs. It wasn't just about my career. My service record was me. It was the documented proof of my existence, the sum of my sacrifices. It was the long nights in Afghanistan, the years of study at West Point, the sweat and the fear and the pride. And with a few keystrokes, they had turned it all to ash. They didn't just want me dead. They wanted me to die in disgrace, my name forever associated with failure and cowardice. But they weren't finished. Their next attack was far more public and infinitely more cruel. The following morning, Thorne sent me a secure link to a streaming news program. I watched on a laptop in the sparse, quiet living room as the bright, cheerful set of a national morning show filled the screen. And there they were, a portrait of familial grief. My mother, Serafina, looking every bit the heartbroken matriarch, her face a mask of elegant sorrow. Beside her sat Tristan, his eyes red-rimmed and brimming with expertly rehearsed tears, his posture slumped in a performance of devastation. "It's been a terrible ordeal for our family," Tristan began, his voice thick with false emotion, as he spoke to the sympathetic host. "My sister, Catherine, she's always had some issues. The pressure of her career, you know. She was always so competitive, so jealous." He choked back a sob that was perfectly timed for maximum effect, a masterclass in manipulation. "We just want her to come home. We're doing everything we can to find her, to get her the help she so desperately needs." Serafina placed a comforting maternal hand on his arm, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She's our daughter," she said, her voice a fragile whisper that carried across the nation, a dagger twisting in my gut. "A mother knows. I always knew she was struggling inside. We love her. We just pray she finds peace, wherever she is." I sat there, frozen, my hands clenched into white-knuckled fists in my lap. The world narrowed to the glowing screen, the sound of their poisonous, perfectly delivered lies. They were painting a masterpiece of deception, casting me as the mentally unstable, jealous villain in their family tragedy. They were using the public's sympathy as a weapon, ensuring that if I ever did surface, I would be seen not as a victim, but as a deranged fugitive. Every word was a calculated strike, designed to dismantle my credibility, to salt the earth of my reputation so that nothing could ever grow there again. The rage inside me was no longer the hot, chaotic fury of a cornered animal. It was becoming something else, something colder, heavier, and far more dangerous. This was the final violation. They could take my money. They could try to take my life. But to attack my service, to defile the uniform that I had worn with pride, to twist my dedication into a story of madness, that was an act of desecration. They had attacked my duty by framing me as a deserter who went AWOL. They had attacked my honor by painting me as a jealous hysteric on national television. They had attacked my country by weaponizing the very institutions I served to orchestrate their crimes. Duty, honor, country, the three hallowed words of the West Point Oath, the creed I had built my life upon. They had spat on all of them. My rage settled, cooling and hardening from a raging fire into a single sharp point of Valyrian steel. I picked up the encrypted phone and dialed Thorne. There was no tremor in my hand, no hesitation in my voice. The time for hiding was over. The time for defense was over. "They've crossed the final line, Colonel," I said, my voice steady and cold. "This is no longer a family matter. They have declared war on an officer of the United States Army." I paused, letting the weight of my next words hang in the air, a promise and a threat. "And they are about to face the consequences." My rage was no longer a fire. It was a weapon being forged. The heat had burned away the last of my fear, leaving behind only the cold, hard certainty of my purpose. I was no longer a victim reacting to their attacks. I was a commander, and it was time to assemble my army and plan my counteroffensive. Colonel Thorne's first move was to connect me with a lawyer. But Evelyn Reed was no ordinary attorney, a former star prosecutor in the Army's Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG. She had left the military to start a boutique law firm in Arlington, Virginia, specializing in one thing: hunting the corporate and political sharks that infested the D.C. Beltway. Our meeting took place not in a plush corner office, but in what felt more like a tactical operations center. The temporary office space was stark and functional, dominated by large monitors displaying encrypted data streams and a whiteboard covered in complex diagrams. Evelyn Reed herself was like her surroundings, sharp, practical, and radiating an intensity that left no room for sentimentality. She was in her late 40s with a severe haircut and eyes that seemed to analyze everything with the precision of a targeting system. She listened to my story without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she didn't offer condolences or sympathy. She offered a strategy. "They think you're dead, or at least neutralized," she said, her voice a low, confident hum. "That's our single greatest advantage. We don't sue them for emotional distress. That's a fight they can drag out for years in the press, painting you as unstable. We gut them. We attack the foundation of their empire." She stood and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "We go after them for conspiracy, wire fraud, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, related to whatever mess Tristan made in Belgium. We don't attack their hearts. They don't have any. We attack what they truly worship, their money and their reputation. We will dismantle the Ashford legacy, brick by fraudulent brick." The next piece of intelligence from Thorne's network was the name of a ghost, Elias Vance. He was the former chief financial officer for Ashford Industries, the family's primary holding company. His career had imploded 5 years ago. Thorne's note was simple. He knows where the bodies are buried because he was forced to dig the graves. I drove myself to meet him, following a winding road deep into the depressed countryside of rural Pennsylvania. The house was a small, dilapidated clapboard structure, its paint peeling, its yard overgrown. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like cardboard and aluminum foil. A man living in a self-made prison of fear. When he answered the door, Elias Vance was a shadow of the confident executive I saw in old photos. He was thin, pale, and his eyes darted nervously at every sound. He tried to send me away, his hands trembling. "I can't help you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what they're capable of." "Yes, I do," I said quietly. "They tried to murder me 2 weeks ago." I told him my story. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of something in his haunted eyes. Not just fear, but a shared understanding. He saw a fellow victim. He let me in. Inside, the house was dark and cluttered. He told me his story, the words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken. He had discovered a secret slush fund General Ashford was using to pay off Tristan's massive gambling debts. When Elias confronted him, threatening to go to the board, my father had been surgical in his retaliation. He didn't just fire Elias, he destroyed him. He orchestrated a smear campaign, planting rumors of incompetence and embezzlement. Elias was blacklisted, his reputation ruined, his life savings drained by legal fees. But that wasn't the worst of it, he said, his eyes welling with tears. "My wife, Maria, she couldn't take the stress, the shame, the threats. They sent men to our house, anonymous calls at all hours. She had a weak heart. she suffered a massive stroke. The doctors said it was the chronic stress. He looked at me, his face a mask of grief and rage. Alistair Ashford didn't just take my career, he took my wife. In that moment, listening to this broken man, my mission crystallized. This was no longer just about me. It wasn't about my stolen trust fund or my tarnished honor. It was about Elias. It was about the young lieutenant whose career my father had crushed. It was for every person the Ashford dynasty had ground into dust to protect their perfect gilded image. My personal war had just become a crusade. My resolve must have shown on my face. Elias seemed to draw strength from it. He stood up and walked to a false panel in the wall, pulling out a small, heavily encrypted hard drive. He thought he destroyed everything, Elias said, his voice now steady. But I kept a copy, a dead man's switch. He handed the drive to me. It felt heavy in my hand, dense with the weight of secrets. "It's all in there," he said. "The offshore accounts, the laundered money, the real story of Tristan's disastrous dealings in Belgium, the recordings of my father's threats, everything you need. This is why they needed your $33 million so desperately. Not just for Tristan's debts, but to cover up a massive international fraud." I held the drive, my knuckles white. This wasn't just evidence. This was a ticking time bomb, and I now held the detonator. The war had been declared. The army had been assembled. And now I had my weapon of mass destruction. My father often used to quote Sun Tzu, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles." He believed he knew me, the dutiful, resilient daughter who would always absorb the blows. He was wrong. He had no idea who I had become. Now I was using his own philosophy against him. I would know my enemy down to the last decimal point. Evelyn Reed's temporary office in Arlington became our war room. The space was operational 24 hours a day, fueled by black coffee and a cold, shared fury. Colonel Thorne had assembled a small vetted team of forensic accountants and data security experts, all former military, all fiercely loyal to him. The air crackled with a low, intense hum of activity. We transformed Elias Vance's hard drive from a simple piece of hardware into the centerpiece of our intelligence operation. The decryption process was painstaking, but once we were in, it was like cracking open a tomb and finding not just one body, but a whole cemetery. The data painted a sickeningly detailed picture of the Ashford Empire's rotten core. It was a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and laundered money. We traced funds flowing from defense contracts into a slush fund, used to pay off Tristan's colossal gambling debts. We found evidence of bribes paid to foreign officials to secure a disastrous Belgian real estate deal, a deal that had cost investors over $20 million. A failure Tristan had orchestrated, and my father had desperately tried to bury. My role was to be the lead analyst, the one who connected the dots. I spent my days and nights staring at spreadsheets and encrypted emails, my military intelligence training allowing me to see patterns where others saw only chaos. I mapped out the flow of money, the network of complicit individuals, the timeline of their crimes. Each new discovery, each piece of evidence, didn't just fuel my anger, it solidified my resolve into something cold and unbreakable. This wasn't just corruption. This was a betrayal of every principle my uniform stood for. This was treasonous. While the financial team dissected the fraud, I knew we needed more. We needed to dismantle the narrative they had built around me and Tristan. That required reaching back inside the walls of the Pentagon, a move fraught with risk. I decided to contact an unlikely ally, Corporal Anya Sharma, a young, brilliant records specialist I had mentored a few years prior. I had seen a spark in her, a fierce intelligence, and an unwavering moral compass. I was betting my life that my assessment of her character was correct. I reached out through a secure, anonymous channel. I didn't tell her the whole story, only that my official record had been illegally altered and that I needed her help to uncover the truth. I told her it was dangerous. Anya's response came back in minutes. "Major, I was there when they announced you were AWOL. It never made sense. Tell me what you need." Her loyalty was a profound relief. Following my precise instructions, using coded keywords I provided, Anya navigated the deep archives of the Pentagon's records system. She was my ghost in the machine. 2 days later, she sent me 2 encrypted files that were more explosive than anything on Elias's hard drive. The first was the original, unalterable charter for the Ashford Family Trust. It explicitly named me as the sole, primary beneficiary, with a clause preventing any changes without my express written consent. Their attempt to seize the $33 million was not just immoral, it was blatantly illegal. The second file was the bombshell. It was a buried internal investigation report detailing an incident during Tristan's last deployment. Due to his gross negligence and failure to follow protocol, he had directly endangered his entire platoon during a live-fire exercise. The investigation had recommended a formal court-martial, but it had been quashed by a command-level directive from the highest echelons. My father had not only covered for him, he had buried a report that should have ended my brother's career. But as I sifted through the supporting documents attached to that investigation, I found the final, most disgusting truth. It was a commendation recommendation, fast-tracked and approved just weeks after his near-fatal blunder. My father had used his immense influence to have Tristan awarded the Bronze Star Medal for the very same operation where his incompetence had almost gotten men killed. A wave of nausea washed over me. I remembered the award ceremony. I remembered the smug, self-satisfied look on Tristan's face as my father pinned the medal to his chest. I remembered the pride in my mother's eyes, a pride she had never shown for any of my legitimate achievements. They hadn't just covered up his failure, they had twisted it into a story of heroism. They had committed the most contemptible act in military culture, stolen valor. He was wearing a medal that real soldiers had bled and died for. I walked into the main room where Evelyn was reviewing the financial evidence. I laid the printed documents on the table in front of her, the trust charter, the buried investigation, and the fraudulent medal citation. She read them in silence, her expression growing colder with each page. When she finished, she looked up at me. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator that knows the hunt is over. "We've got them," she said, her voice soft but lethal. "We have enough to not only restore your name and recover your money, Catherine. We have enough to send the entire Ashford dynasty to Fort Leavenworth for a very, very long time." She stood up and straightened her jacket. "It's time to go to war." The Albert V. Bryan U.S. Courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, is a place of imposing, sterile power. It was the perfect stage for the final act of the Ashford dynasty. They arrived as if attending a coronation, not a preliminary hearing. My father, General Alistair Ashford, was immaculate in his army dress blue uniform, the chest full of medals, a silent testament to a lifetime of honor he did not possess. My mother, Seraphina, was the picture of aristocratic grace, her expression one of pained endurance. Tristan, fidgeting beside them, looked like a petulant boy forced to attend church. They sat in the front row, a united front of power and privilege, expecting a swift and quiet victory. Their lead counsel, a high-priced lawyer from a prestigious D.C. firm, rose to address the court. His voice was smooth, confident, and dripping with condescension. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing dismissively towards our side, "we are here today to address a frivolous and deeply unfortunate matter. This is not a legitimate legal dispute, but rather the paranoid fantasy of a troubled young officer." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. A woman with a documented history of instability and a clear pathological jealousy toward the successes of her younger brother. "We move for an immediate dismissal on all counts." The words were meant to be a public execution, a final nail in the coffin of my reputation. He expected to be addressing a ghost. On cue, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Every head turned. I walked down the central aisle, not in the rags of a fugitive, but in my own immaculate Army Service uniform, the one I had earned the right to wear. My decorations, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, were perfectly aligned on my chest, each one a silent rebuttal to their lies. My footsteps were measured, my back straight, my gaze fixed forward. I did not look at them, but I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel their world tilting on its axis. I took my seat beside Evelyn Reed. The smug confidence had vanished from their lawyer's face, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. My father's face, once a mask of stoic power, had frozen, the blood draining from it. My mother's perfectly manicured hand flew to her pearls, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't conceal. Evelyn Reed rose slowly, her presence commanding the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm and clear, "counsel for the defense bases his motion to dismiss on the claim that my client, Major Catherine Elfrida, is mentally unstable and went AWOL from her post. A compelling story." She let the silence stretch for a beat. "However, we have declassified mission logs from the Pentagon, authenticated this morning by the Inspector General's office, showing that at the precise time of her alleged mental breakdown, Major Elfrida was, in fact, leading a top-secret strategic briefing inside a secure facility." An officer from the IG's office stepped forward to present the file to the clerk. The judge, an older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the document. The defense counsel's face went from confused to alarmed. Evelyn wasn't finished. She let the first revelation settle before delivering the next blow. "We would now like to call our first witness to the stand, Mr. Elias Vance." The name hit the room like a grenade. My father shot to his feet, his military composure completely shattered. "Objection!" he roared, his voice cracking. "On what grounds, General?" the judge asked, her voice dangerously quiet. He had none. He sank back into his seat, his face ashen. Serafina gripped the armrest of her chair, her knuckles white. Elias Vance, no longer the trembling man from the Pennsylvania farmhouse, walked to the stand with a quiet dignity. Guided by Evelyn's precise questions, he calmly, methodically, and with irrefutable documentation, laid bare the entire Ashford financial conspiracy. He spoke of the slush fund, the gambling debts, the desperate illegal measures taken to cover Tristan's $20 million failure in Belgium. When he was finished, the courtroom was deathly silent, but Evelyn was just getting started. She turned on the large courtroom monitors. and for the next hour she presented a relentless barrage of evidence from the hard drive. Emails detailing the conspiracy to seize my trust, encrypted communications, bank statements from offshore shell corporations. The evidence was overwhelming, a digital avalanche that buried them in their own filth. Finally, she presented her last two exhibits. First, the original unalterable trust document, proving my sole ownership. And second, the buried internal investigation into Tristan's negligence, followed immediately by the citation for his fraudulent Bronze Star. The judge, whose expression had grown colder and harder with each new piece of evidence, removed her glasses and looked directly at my family. The air in the room was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. She was no longer just a judge. She was an executioner. Based on the preliminary evidence presented here today, she declared, her voice ringing with an authority that echoed off the marble walls. This court finds sufficient cause to proceed. Furthermore, the evidence suggests a pattern of criminal activity that extends far beyond the scope of this civil hearing. She looked from my father's horrified face to my mother's crumbling facade, to Tristan's terrified, childish expression. Therefore, this court hereby orders a full, comprehensive criminal investigation by both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Army's Criminal Investigation Division into the affairs of General Alistair Ashford, Mrs. Seraphina Ashford, and Lieutenant Tristan Ashford. She lifted the gavel. The sound of it striking the block was not a tap. It was a gunshot, a final deafening crack that signaled the end of an empire. In the stunned silence that followed, I watched the Ashford dynasty, my creators and my would-be assassins, collapse before the entire world. The aftermath of the hearing was not a celebration. It was a controlled demolition. The shockwave from the judge's gavel radiated outwards from the Alexandria courthouse, and the Ashford empire began to crumble with breathtaking speed. The news reports were relentless, a media firestorm that fed on the spectacular fall of a titan. Defense contracts were suspended pending investigation. Security clearances were revoked. The Ashford name, once a synonym for power and honor, became a mark of disgrace. The consequences for my family were swift and severe. Tristan, stripped of his fraudulent medal, faced a court-martial that was brutally efficient. He was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and sentenced to a long, inglorious term at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth. My father, the great General Alistair Ashford, was spared the indignity of a trial by his own body. He suffered a massive stroke the day after the hearing, one that silenced his powerful voice forever, leaving him a vacant, hollow shell of the man he once was, trapped inside a broken mind. I performed two final duties, not as a daughter, but as an officer closing out a field operation. First, I visited my father in the private hospital wing that had become his gilded cage. He sat in a wheelchair by a large window, staring blankly at a garden he no longer recognized. His eyes were empty. There was no flicker of recognition, no rage, no remorse, just nothing. I stood before him for a long moment, then quietly placed his West Point class ring on the table beside him. A final severance. I left without a word. Next, I went to the military prison to see Tristan before his transfer to Leavenworth. We sat on opposite sides of a thick pane of plexiglass, the air sterile and cold. He looked small and broken, the arrogance stripped away, leaving only a terrified boy. He wept, his words muffled through the speaker. He was sorry, so sorry. I listened, my face impassive. "No, you're not," I replied, my voice even and devoid of emotion. You're not sorry you did it, Tristan. You're only sorry you got caught. I saw the flicker of truth in his eyes before he dissolved back into tears. I stood up and walked away. The final confrontation had to be with my mother. I met her at the McLean estate. She was under house arrest, the grand home now a cold, echoing mausoleum. Federal agents were tagging furniture and ceiling rooms, the assets of a fallen empire being cataloged for seizure. The perfect, serene mask of Seraphina Ashford had finally cracked. Her face was a ruin of rage and disbelief. "You've destroyed everything," she shrieked the moment she saw me, her voice ragged. "Everything we built. You were a curse on this family from the day you were born." I looked at the woman who had given me life and then tried to take it away, and I felt nothing but a vast clinical distance. She was a problem said I had finally solved. "You should have just disappeared quietly," she screamed, her hands clenched at her sides. "You took everything from your brother. You were supposed to protect him. That was your duty." Her words, meant to be the ultimate condemnation, were instead the ultimate clarification. She would never understand. She would never change. "You still don't get it, do you?" I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper. "I'm not the curse. I am the consequence." I took a step closer, my gaze unwavering. "You and Father taught me that winning is everything. That sentiment is a weakness, that the mission must be accomplished at all costs." I gave her a small, cold smile. "I just learned the lesson too well. So for that education, thank you." I turned and walked out of that house for the last time, not looking back. Her screams faded behind me, the last dying echoes of a world that had turned to ash. The war was over. I had won. That night, I stood on the balcony of an anonymous hotel in Washington, D.C., looking down at the glittering web of city lights, a map of the power I had just defied. The adrenaline had faded. The strategic focus was gone. And in their place, there was a terrifying, cavernous emptiness. The enemies had been defeated. The mission was complete. But the question that remained was a quiet, unnerving whisper in the silence. Who was I now? I was no longer Catherine Ashford, daughter of a fallen dynasty, and after everything, I no longer wanted to be Major Elfrida, a soldier in their army. I had destroyed my past and my present, and I had no idea what my future looked like. The emptiness that followed my victory was a quiet, hollow ache. The war was over, but the soldier remained, standing in the ruins with no new orders. A few weeks later, I made a decision. I submitted my request for an honorable discharge from the United States Army. Colonel Thorne handled the process with quiet efficiency. We met one last time at a small diner in Alexandria, the kind of place with worn vinyl booths and coffee that had been brewing for hours. He slid a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside were the documents for a new life, a new identity. "You've served this country with distinction, Catherine," he said, his voice full of a warmth I had come to cherish. "Now it's time to serve yourself." Before leaving D.C. for good, there was one last stop I had to make. I went to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, a sprawling, open-air space of granite and water. I stood alone before the statue of the man in the wheelchair, reading the words I had first found in a dusty library book. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena. I had been in the arena. My face had been marred by dust and sweat and blood. I had fought valiantly. I had won. And now I had earned the right to leave. I didn't choose an easy life. I used a small portion of the recovered trust fund to buy a secluded log cabin on a mountainside in Montana. near the breathtaking expanse of Glacier National Park. The air there was thin and clean, and the silence was vast, broken only by the wind in the pines. It was in that profound quiet that I began the slow process of unlearning. I had to learn how to breathe without constantly assessing for threats. I had to learn how to read a book for the simple joy of the story, not for intelligence gathering. One day I drove to a local animal shelter and found him. He was an old German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, with wise, gentle eyes and a slight limp. The card on his kennel said his name was Miller and that he'd been abandoned. He was a fellow survivor. We recognized each other immediately. Together, Miller and I explored the wilderness that was now our home. We hiked the winding trails, his steady presence a comforting weight beside me. We watched the sun set behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. In the raw, untamed beauty of nature, I found a serenity that no military victory could ever provide. I was slowly, carefully learning how to be happy. One crisp autumn afternoon, a small package arrived from Thorne. Inside, nestled in a velvet box, was my Legion of Merit medal, which I thought had been lost forever in the chaos. Tucked beneath it was a small handwritten note. It said, "Your honor was never in their hands to take. It was always yours." I held the medal, its weight familiar in my palm. It was no longer a symbol of a war I had fought against others, but a quiet affirmation of the war I had fought for myself. I didn't put it away in a drawer. I placed it on the rough-hewn windowsill of my cabin, where the golden Montana sunlight caught the polished metal, making it gleam. Looking out at the majestic, snow-capped mountains, with Miller sleeping peacefully at my feet, a profound sense of peace settled over me for the first time in a very long time. I was no longer Major Elfrida, the soldier. I was no longer Catherine Ashford, the disgraced daughter. I was just Catherine. And my legacy would not be written in battles won or enemies defeated, but in the quiet, peaceful days I was finally learning how to live. Looking out at these Montana mountains, it's hard to believe how far I've come. My arena was a courtroom, but I know yours might be a dinner table, a phone call, or just the quiet weight of expectation. My story is proof that your legacy is not what is given to you, but what you build from the ashes. If my journey has given you a measure of strength, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. There are more stories of survival and resilience here, and I believe each one is a light in the darkness.